In our previous videos, we've used a TinyDb database to persist data in our emulator. And one thing that's interesting is even though I shut down the emulator and restarted it, I still have the plants that I created earlier, which is great news. Now, there's a bit of a challenge here though. TinyDb is literally Tiny Database is very simple. It's not meant for heavy queries or anything like that. And what we're going to find is if we take a look at one of these things like Eastern Redbud, Cincinnati Zoo, and Botanical Garden, my favorite, the trick is the tag has to be unique in our database. And for the tag, we're using the plant name, but it's very possible that a plant could get duplicated. So let's see, if I put Eastern Redbud, and I use the exact same spelling, exact same capitalization, Redbud, like so. Location, let's say my home, and then description, we'll say edible flowers. Whoops, uh-oh, I mistakenly hit a button there, just a moment. Okay, we have it fixed. So Eastern Redbud, my home, and flowering now. I'm going to choose Save, and then I'm going to choose Open so we can see the list of plants. Now you would think we would have 3 plants now because this is the third we've entered, but we're reusing the same tag name for Eastern Redbud, so actually that's going to overwrite the one that we created before because tag name has to be unique. If we save something else to with an existing tag name, in other words, if we reuse a tag, it's going to overwrite what's already there. So you see Eastern Redbud, flowering now, location my home. Okay, what's a good way to make sure that we get a new row even if we enter the same plant name? Well, the answer is we need to use a different plant, or I'm sorry, we need to use a different tag. Now, in other databases, we'll call this tag a primary key. A primary key is essentially a unique identifier for each row in a database. A primary key can be database generated, and if that's the case, it's simply a counter variable. It has no natural counterpart in the actual item stored. In other words, it's like student number 1, student number 2, student number 3, student number 4. If those students happen to line up in a different order, then they would get assigned different numbers. There's nothing inherent in you as a student that makes you number 2 or number 1 or number 4. That's just an arbitrary number that is used to describe one student compared to a different student. So no natural counterpart if it is database generated. Primary keys, and by the way, these bullets down here are assuming database generated. You can have a primary key that's not database generated. You can have a unique identifier, in other words, but we're talking specifically about a database generated auto-incremented primary key. So every row in the database has to be unique, even if it's just this primary key that sets them apart. So how do we make this primary key, which is essentially a counter? Well, TinyDb, at least to my knowledge, doesn't have a primary key facility built into it, so we have to make one ourselves. And it's pretty easy. We just create a global variable, we increment it, or in other words, add 1 each time we store a plant. But then the trick is, what if we close the screen and come back to it? What if we close the app and come back to it? We don't want to start all over at 0. So we need to store the highest number of this counter in the database also, and we need to store it with its own separate, totally different tag. Okay, and then whenever we open the screen, we need to read from the database, and we need to see what the last number used was, so we can start there. So if I save 4 plants today, tomorrow I want to start with number 5. If I save 3 more plants tomorrow, then the next day I want to start with number 8. So we want to make sure we have a place where we write down where we left off so we can pick back up there the next day without overwriting any of our work. Now, one trick is all of this gets saved in the same database, so we have to exclude this special tag that represents our highest primary key from any results. There's an alternate approach where we can just look at all the primary keys and find the highest number. That one might be a better approach, especially for a small number of records. So I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to go to my screen 1, and one thing I need to do now is wipe the database out, because I'm going to basically make a generated primary key. Generated primary key exists in most modern databases. Honestly, I haven't found a good way to do it in TinyDb, so I'm just going to make it from hand. So first of all, we're going to do some initialization. So we'll go to our screen 1, and we're going to say when screen 1 initialized. Now, I only want to do this one time, but I'm going to go to our database, and I'm going to say clear all, which just wipes it out, and then I'm going to save. I just want to empty the database so I can start with fresh data. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I'm going to reload the emulator, just a moment, and I'm just going to confirm. Probably when I go back, I'm going to need to go back and forth one time to clear out the database, but I just want to confirm that I have cleared the database. I'll confirm that by seeing an empty list. Okay, list is here. Back to screen 1, and at that point it should reinitialize. And click open again. And we see now an empty list, so we know that our database has been emptied out. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete that block I just put in. Again, all I wanted to do was to clear out what was in the database so I could start fresh. Okay, I'll tell you what I will do though. I am going to bring that initialize block back. Actually, no, I don't need to. Well, yeah, I don't need the initialize block. I just need a global variable. So I'm going to say initialize global, and we're going to say plant ID 2. Okay, let's give it a number. So I'm going to go to math, and we're going to pick the initial number 0. Now, what we will do is we have to figure out the highest ID that's in the database. Actually, let's hold that thought for just a second. We want to think about where we're going to use this plant ID. So let me scroll down, and you see where we have tag get plant name now. Let's remove that, and let's say we're going to go to our variables, and we're going to say get, okay, global plant ID. Now at this point, it would only save one. It would only save one plant at a time. It would only save one plant total, because right now that plant ID is always a 0. Because you see we've initialized it to 0. We're not changing it. We're keeping it at 0. So let's make a little change here. Let's add one more thing. We're going to say, I'm going to say variable, and I'm going to say set. Okay, and let's say global plant ID 2, and now we're going to say we're going to get math. So we'll get this little plug-in here where we can add two things together. Okay, now what are we going to add? We're going to add that global ID plus 1. So variables, get global plant ID, and math, and we'll put the literal number 1 in here. Okay, we'll put in just a number 1, like so. So what are we doing here? We're taking the existing plant ID, which is 0, adding 1 to it, which makes it 1, and then we assign that new value 1 back to plant ID. That's for the first plant we save. For the next plant we save, plant ID will already be 1. We're going to add 1 more to it. That'll make it 2. The next plant ID will be 2. We add 1 to it. It makes it 3. So you see, every time we click on button save, we're going to add 1 to this global plant ID. That works well, but there is one consideration, and that is we don't know what the highest ID is. So there's an easy way that we can take care of that. One way is we can read every row in the database and just do a little bit of mathematical comparison until we find the highest ID. That would be a good thing to do in our initialization block, although it might get a bit long when we, if we have a lot of data in the database. Another thing that we can do is we can make another one of these blocks where we call the specimens table, or the specimens database, and we simply store the highest number in the database along with another tag, something like highest plant ID, and then we save whatever the highest plant ID is. So that might be a good idea as well, and that one might even be a little quicker to do. Okay, Let's do it the simple way. I'm going to go to my database called specimens, and we're going to call the store value again. Okay, store value, we're going to say, let's move this guy out of the way. Let's give it a tag, but for the tag we'll give it a string literal. Okay, so we'll say max plant ID. Okay, and value to store is going to be our global plant ID again. So I'll go to variables and we'll say get global plant ID. So that's simply the highest plant identifier that we have. Okay, now what about when we first load this screen, when we've been away, when we've closed the app? Okay, we need to retrieve this value and we need to save it in our variable plant ID instead of saving 0. It's okay to initialize that to 0, that's no problem. But let's go ahead and reinitialize it in the initialize block for our screen. So in other words, I'm going to go to my screen, I'm going to grab the initialize block, and in the initialize block, I'm going to say get our specimens table, and we're going to use get value. Okay? Okay, hang on just 1 second, because I need to grab our variable as well. So actually, I can just grab it from here. Okay, set global plant ID to call specimens get value tag. What's our tag? Max plant ID. So I'll copy and paste. Okay, and scroll up. Okay, value if not there, we'll make it 0. Actually, let's see if it will let us put a number in here. Just a moment. I'll feel a bit safer if we actually put a number in here. So we'll save it to 0. Okay, now I know I kind of talked in circles a bit there, so let me just refresh what we're doing. We create a global variable. What does global variable mean? Global variable means it's available within different blocks, within several blocks, unlike our local variables that kind of have this defined scope that we've seen before. Okay, so that's part 1. Part 2, we associate each plant with this plant ID. But before we do that, we add 1 to the ID to make sure it's unique every time. Finally, after we've added 1 to the ID, we put it into this special little compartment here in our database that is max plant ID. And that says, okay, what is the highest plant ID that we've used, so we can make sure that next time we use one higher and we don't start overwriting records. Okay. The only trick is when we initialize the screen, we have to get that max plant ID and we have to assign that max plant ID back to this plant ID global variable. Now, if there is no max plant ID, we just assume we're going to start it with 0. So this plant ID gets used several places. Initialize to whatever the last number was, and then every time we save a plant, add 1, and use that as that unique identifier, that unique tag name. Let's see it work. Okay, give it just a moment to load. Okay, now I'm going to add Eastern Redbud, location, Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. Okay, I have to get a little tricky to get down here to the description, and I'll simply say an excellent tree, which it is, and then done. Okay, now I'm going to choose save. Now here's something I'm going to do. I'm going to change only the location name, and we will call this maybe Zurich Botanical Gardens. Okay, Gradens, close enough, Gardens. And then I'll choose done, and then save again. And then let's change the description this time. Let's say native to Midwest USA, and I know that's kind of coming behind, but there it is. Okay, and let's change it from Zurich Botanical Gardens to perhaps, what do you say? Birmingham Botanical Gardens. And done. And I've kept the name the same this time, and save. Okay, Just for S&Gs, let's go ahead and change Eastern Redbud to a different plant. Let's say Catalpa speciosa. Okay, and once again done, and save. So now this should be number 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the database. They should have these unique primary keys. Let's click open and see what we get. Now I had to do a bit of refactoring because I got something interesting. But what you will see is now, even though we have Eastern Redbud duplicated 3 times in 3 different locations, we have 3 different rows where before we only had 1 row. The problem is, take a look at this. Our plant ID, that additional tag we added, is appearing here. So we need to add some logic to this list screen to remove that tag. The error that I got was on that row, and to be able to see it, I had to take this /t parsing out that we did earlier. So just a moment and we will solve for that. I'll put this back as it were, and then we'll solve for that extra tag. What we need to do to fix this is fairly straightforward. We just have to fall back on an if test. Okay, let's remember what this huge block is doing. And again, what screen are we looking at? We're looking at this screen that shows each of our plants in a list. So what we're doing is we are iterating over our database results, okay, for each item in specimen.getTags. So specimens, that's our TinyDb database, and for each item means we want to visit each item one at a time. What we need to do is we need to add an if test in here to say, you know what, if the tag happens to be that max plant ID, and I'll copy the verbatim text to make sure that I don't have a mistype. So if the tag happens to be max plant ID, then simply ignore the tag. It's not one that we want to show. Okay, so I'm going to go to logic, and we're going to say, actually, let's see, we're going to go to control rather, and we're going to say, we could do, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do kind of like a negation thing here. Okay, so I'm going to drop right there. That'll be fine. Okay, take this block, move the block in here. So in other words, this block here, I will only want to execute, this entire block here, I only want to execute if we're dealing with a plant ID and not that special get max ID tag that we just made up. So I'm going to say if we'll need to do a comparison, just a moment. Not will be fine. Okay, if get item, okay. And I'll tell you what, we'll use one of these guys. We'll change it to not equals. Okay, just a moment. I'm going to assemble this together and then explain it. Okay, and a literal text tag. I'll tell you what we'll do. We're going to say like so, and text, and like so, and then paste. Okay, and drop. Okay, what are we doing here? I'm saying if the tag that we're looking at is not the max plant ID tag, then we want to go through all this work and display it in the list. Otherwise, if the tag is the max plant ID tag, then we want to skip this entire block. We don't have an else set up, so nothing else is going to happen. We're simply going to skip it. Let me go ahead and save this, and what we should see, what I'm expecting to see when I relaunch, is that it is going to show the 4 plants that we entered, but it's not going to show that number 4, that mysterious number 4 that was sitting down below. That number 4 was simply the max plant ID from the last few times we've saved to this database. So let's see how it works now. And we see now with this fix, we have our 3 red buds and our catalpa in a more user-friendly, readable list, and that counter number no longer exists. So to recap, what do we need to do to create a primary key? Initialize a global variable, increment that variable each time we want to store a plant, store the counter, the highest number in the database with a new tag, read the counter when we initialize any screen that's going to be updating the database or inserting into the database. And then be sure to exclude this tag from any results. As an alternate, and maybe in our next video, we'll take a look at how to do this without a tag. Instead, we will simply iterate over all of the tags and find the highest number. I look forward to seeing you then.